Hey guys, so thanks so much for your feedback on last week's video on Poi for the absolute rope beginner. Because of your feedback, I found out there was a lot of other cool stuff that I can include, so this is now going to be a three-part series. Before we start off though, a quick fun civics lesson. I happen to live in DC, and we're in the middle of a government shutdown right now. Now, one of the funky things about living in DC is that we are not actually a state, which means that a lot of the stuff that you expect a state to do, like say administering state parks and the like, is something that we actually have to get the federal government to do. That is, the park that I'm sitting in right now, Malcolm X Park, or it's officially known as Meridian Hill Park, it's about 3 blocks away from where I live in Adams Morgan, is actually not administered by a local Parks and Recreation Service. It is administered by the National Park Service, the same guys that are administering Yosemite and Yellowstone, which means that the park is shut down right now. I had to climb over a barrier to get in here today, but the other good piece of news is that the National Park Police are also paid by the government, so they are not around to yell at me for having done so. So I'm going to count that as a win. Anyhow, so last video we talked a little bit about the anatomy of a poi, and I got a lot of really good questions then about specifications for poi. That is, not just how do you hold it, but what do you want to look for in how heavy a head should be, handles construction, things like that. So this is going to be a video to go further into detail on those sorts of things. To start with, let's move down the poi from top to bottom. First up is the head. Now, what I'm using right here is a set of contact poi that have 90mm hollow vinyl stage ball heads. They've been drilled out and had a rope attached to them and everything, but I think the weight is pretty close to the original specifications of about 175 grams. Now, these are among the heaviest set of practice poi I have ever used, and it's something that's just built in the materials. A lot of people, when they're first starting off, will use much lighter sets of poi, say like dropping a set of tennis balls in a pair of socks, which are quite light. So why would you want one over the other? Well, a couple things that heavy poi are really good for. When you are performing things like stalls. A stall is any time you take the poi as it's moving and kind of stop it from moving and either pull it again in the direction it was originally going or back in the other direction. Stalls are really, really cool in that way. They're sometimes called 0 points. That is, points at which you are making the acceleration of the poi drop to 0 so that then you can change it to moving in any direction that you like, which, you know, if you're just starting off, is still a little ways away from you, but here's where it gets important. The heavier your poi heads are, usually the easier it is to make those stalls, number one, happen in the first place, and number two, look really clean. Which isn't to say that you can't do them with lighter poi, it's just, with lighter poi, it is more of a struggle to make them clean. There is essentially less drag on the poi, and thus it's a little bit harder to get them where you need them to go. Also, with heavier poi, it is much easier to keep them in plane. Now, if you don't know what the term plane means, the next video I'm going to go into that in some detail. But essentially, as you're starting off with a lot of beginner tricks, you're going to have very, very poor control over your planes. And you would think then that heavier poi would be the better way to go on that, but that's not always the case. In fact, in a lot of instances, because you don't know where your planes are going to wind up, it's actually not in your best interest to have poi that are less likely to get out of plane. In cases like that, if you can't get out of the way, you're more likely to hit yourself. And of course, with heavier poi, that rapidly becomes an issue because they tend to hurt a lot more when they do hit you. So for most beginners, I actually recommend a lighter set of poi. Not as light as tennis balls. I usually recommend to people that they take about like a half a cup of rice and drop it into a plastic bag, seal it up with duct tape, and drop that into an old pair of socks. And that is neither so light that it's too difficult to keep things in plane, but also not too heavy either. The other effect that those kinds of things have is that as you're spinning for long periods of time, it's going to take you a little while to get used to the weight of the poi. The heavier the poi are, the faster you are going to reach a point that you're going to get fatigued. The lighter your set of poi, the longer you're going to be able to spin them before you run out of energy. Therefore, one of the reasons I like to give beginners lighter sets of poi is because they're more likely to spin for longer with them. Okay, so what about the tethers? Now, The tethers that I'm using on these set of poi are, I think they're 5/16 of an inch. They're just braided nylon rope, right? And you can find a variety of different materials, from thicker ropes to things like flow cords, which are actually a cord material that has a really, really soft outside and can have things like swivels in them, all the way down to a lot of beginner sets of poi are actually constructed with tethers that are very, very thin nylon strings. Whenever possible, I tend to steer people away from the nylon strings, and here's why. As you're first starting to learn to spin poi, and especially if you're adopting this grip where you're holding the poi between your thumb and index finger, what's going to happen is that you're going to build up calluses on the inside of your index finger as the poi slides around inside of that little joint, right? There's nothing wrong with it. It's what happens. It's akin to if you're picking up a stringed instrument, building up the calluses on your fingers of the fretting hand. But I tend to find that it's easier to do that with slightly thicker tethers, like, say, if you're using socks or these ropes, than it is with the thinner nylon strings. The reason being, there's another thing that we use thin strings for, things like cutting cheese and clay, and it has the exact same effect on your fingers. Namely, those thin nylon strings, if you're holding them between your thumb and your index finger, will just strip off all the skin on the inside of your finger, whereas if you have something thicker like a rope, you are more inclined to get something more akin to a blister to start off with that will more easily transition into a good callus. Which isn't to say that the nylon strings have no use or anything like that, but I just find them more difficult for this purpose. Of course, if you're going for looped handles and not worrying at all about holding the tether between your thumb and index finger, then it's less of a thing to worry about, right? Now onto the handles. Once again, if you're using the looped handles, there's very little you have to worry about aside from whether they're single loops or double loops. A single loop is likely to hold onto your hand much easier because it uses that capture knot that I showed you last week. When you're using ball handles like this, there's the additional option to consider not only of what type of ball handle, but also how much it weighs. And there's a variety of ball handles that are available out there. I've seen people construct poi with wooden doll's heads. These are palm grips from Lantern Smith, based up in New England. There are also PX3 knobs that are normally used on the end of juggling clubs, and silicone balls that are made by Play Juggling that you can find on, say, like Master Ong's poi. I tend to like the silicone handles because they're grippier. However, they do tend to get slippery if your hands are sweaty. So just use your best judgment on that. If you are in a situation like, say, a performance where you are definitely going to have sweaty hands and you're doing a lot of throws and the like, I actually recommend using a PX3 handle or a doll's head in that kind of situation because its behavior is going to be exactly the same whether your hand is sweaty or not. Whereas with the silicone handles, they get a little bit slippery, and if you're not anticipating it, that can be a problem. In terms of the weight of the handles, now the lighter the handle is, the more likely when you throw it that the tether is going to rotate around the head. That is, the head becomes the center of gravity of it. The heavier the handle is, the more likely it is that the center of gravity is going to become a point along the tether and that it's going to rotate around that point, right? Why this is important is if you are doing some old school contact moves, like, say, propellers, or, I'm going to totally mess this up, wibbles, they almost essentially require that your handles be close to the weight of your heads. I think it's usually a relationship of like 2/3 or something like that that you want to be looking for. Wibbles in particular are nearly impossible to do if you don't have heavier handles. Another thing that heavier handles are really useful for is in terms of learning isolations like this. The heavier the handle, the more likely you're going to find that balance point, middle of tether, to get this move down. Now that said, that doesn't mean that lighter handles are bad. I personally prefer lighter handles. They're good for these kinds of fun isolated throws and the like, and I just personally find that once I make a throw, a heavier handle I'm almost dreading catching because it's going to have a much harder impact on me when it finally lands. But this is another one of those things that there is absolutely no right answer on. It is whatever is to your taste. If you feel like your handles are too light, try making them heavier. If you feel like your handles are too heavy, try making them lighter. Find what works best for you. Find what makes you want to spin the most. Finally, let's talk about the length of our poi. Now, there is probably nothing in the personal taste of poi spinning that is more variable than the length of a set of poi. A couple years ago, it was extremely fashionable to have sets of poi that were really short, from the thumb joint to about mid-bicep, or even as short as the elbow in some cases, right? What that length is really good for is, once again, stalls. The shorter your poi are, the cleaner and easier your stalls are going to be. So if you've seen people doing these kind of really rapid plane shifting stalls, in a lot of cases, they're using much shorter poi in order to do it. If you've seen, say, like Charlie Cushing do this kind of thing, he's got very, very short poi. I think he's got one of the shortest sets that I've seen. The other thing that they're really good for is when you start playing around with inside moves, like barrel rolls, or things like Lovelaces. Also, the shorter the poi are, the more likely you are to be able to do things like buzzsaws without hitting yourself. Again, as you're doing any kind of inside move, the longer your poi are, the more your arms have to be stretched out in order to avoid them hitting you. So, for example, a barrel roll is very easy for me at this length because the poi are much shorter than my arms. Whereas if they're at full length, the barrel roll is much more difficult for me to do because I have to have my arms out almost all the way away from me in order to keep from hitting myself, right? Another thing that the length of the tethers has an impact on is contact poi. Because contact poi is based around the handle and tether moving, the longer the poi are, the longer they're going to roll for. So irregardless of the size of the poi head, if you've got really, really long tethers, they're going to keep rolling for a long time. Keep that in mind. Also, when it comes to more complex throws, things that are closer to like juggling and the like, such as this, it's actually helpful to have longer tethers just as a pure matter of having a larger target to aim for when you catch. The shorter your poi are, the more difficult the catch is because you've only got, you know, that much to work with. The longer your tethers are, the more of a, you could call it, I guess, like a strike zone or something like that if you're a baseball fan, the more of an area you have to work with as kind of your wiggle room on making the catch, right? Cool. So that's some more information about poi construction and what you might want to look for as you are playing around with your, or looking to acquire your first set of poi. Again, use whatever makes you enjoy spinning. There are, of course, certain things that you can do to tune your poi if you're finding that some things are just not happening for you. But by and large, look for what makes you enjoy spinning and continuing with the art, because the practice is what matters in the end. So I will be back next week with the last installment of this video series, and I will take you through what I consider to be the absolute two most basic concepts in spinning poi, so that you can add those concepts to your vocabulary and begin to understand what you're going to encounter on your flow journey. So thank you so much for watching, and I will be back next week for you. Peace.